Good morning. I'm glad to announce our second working day started. Our second day's principal keynote speaker is Levon Abrahamian, National Academy of Science corresponding member, Ethnography and Archaeology Institute, Contemporary Anthropology Department head. He will open the Yerevan topic today. His communication is called Tamanyan Yerevan between constructivism and Stalin era architecture. Tamanyan wanted to build a cozy, small city, initially intended for 150,000 inhabitants, later on upgraded to 300,000, then added a little more, which already in 1970 went up to a monster proportion of 1 million. This is my colleague David Vazanchan's caricature demonstrating how Armenia turned into a city of these dimensions. And this is Tamanyan's statue downtown Yerevan. It seems to be a mockery of this installation. I will be speaking about Tamanyan's Yerevan. And in my opinion, this is one of the most important buildings, in my opinion, built by Tamanyan, because we can't handle everything in this short presentation. We're talking about the Opera and Ballet Theater building. Everyone has seen it. I hope our guests have also seen it firsthand. The design was made in 1926. They broke ground in 1930. In 1939, it already had this facade that we see now, and in 1953, it was completed after his death by his son. To build this, Tamanyan seems as though he did something quite weird. There was a chapel, rather a church, Gethsemane Chapel, dating back to 12th, 13th centuries. But in 1679, it perished in an earthquake. Some ruins remain. End of the 18th century, this not so remarkable nondescript church was rebuilt. So Tamanyan decided that this would be the location of the site of the Opera and Ballet theater that he intended to build. Why? It may seem understandable that in the Soviet times, all of the churches had to be demolished in this anti-religious wave. There are numerous examples from Russia and other Soviet republics, including Yerevan, where they specifically demolished religious buildings. This one is especially strange because he was the founder of the Committee for the Preservation of Monuments and its first chairman. So this is not a very remarkable monument, but why pull it down? So I'll try to demonstrate a striking contrast with his entire career and creative work. He is not just a run-of-the-mill architect. Let's start with this Gethsemane Chapel. Thankfully, a record of his conversation with Marty Rosarian survived, which has been put down by not a not so reputable author, but it's been verified. Sarian tells him, "Can't you build the opera somewhere else? Do you really have to pull down this church?" And for the first time, Tamanyan confesses that this is the place where 1,000 years ago, Vahagni song, a pagan song cathedral was standing here, used to be standing here, and I want to build a new Soviet song cathedral right where another song cathedral was there. So instead of one cathedral, he wants to build another one. Sarian doesn't seem to be very keen on this idea, but the same author interviews Sarian much later when opera was already built. Sarian was in ripe old age, and he said this boy literally knew something when he went for this. So pulling down the church had a completely different rationale. What did he intend to build there? The opera and ballet title was adopted much later by this building. According to his design, it should have been the people's house, popular house, as it was initially intended to be called. This is the plan. This is where they now hold political rallies. It's called Place de France, and this is where they hold the political rallies. What's remarkable is that he intended this to comprise two sections, the winter section and the summer section. They had to be joined or divided by an iron curtain, which should have been raised during major festivities and celebrations. The intention was to be the site for major festivals. I have to acknowledge and thank Haik Tamanyan. He is a great grandchild, the former director of the Tamanyan Museum, for sharing with me these designs and allowing to use them. So this is how it should have looked as early as in 1927 from the side which you can see it. The other side was not built anyway. This is already getting closer to the final. The top part that you see, the elevated part, this is where that curtain had to be raised. So it had to be concealed during that construction. Now they use it to store and move stage sets. This highlights the whole idea. This is the partition. This is the part where it should have been open air seating. And this part below was the closed session. So all of these, this is from the square, not the opera. Plus, all of these festivities and marches should have taken place there. They had to pass through the building along the partition. Tamanyan has thought of a remarkable idea. The cross-section that I just showed you during the festivals, when the curtain was raised and both sections were joined, that also automatically enlarged the stage. So he also intended for the chairs in the parterre to be elevated and turned around. So vehicles, parades, marches, troops could march through the stage. It was sort of a transparent building, and I'll return to that shortly. So this made something quite interesting possible. So the People's House became a place for a location for festivities and celebrations. The chairs never were constructing because that was too costly, the rotating ones. So that part of the design was not approved initially. As for the funding, because the question will arise this way or other, it was to be allocated the funding by the Transcaucasian Federation. The prerequisites for this building was that when the Transcaucasian Federation was founded, one of these first sessions had to be held in Yerevan. They found no place, no venue to accommodate everyone and hold that session. This is when it was decided. Well, the session was held close to this current site, and that's right where and when they decided to go for this building. And the Transcaucasian Federation was committed to help out with the funding. This building had other properties. It did not have balconies. The amphitheater was built in such a way as to create particular acoustics. Everything was calculating. All of it combined created a wonderful ambiance. Everyone present and the participants or the audience. The participants in the audience got really close to each other and were united somehow, reminding of Bakhtin's brilliantly analyzed medieval European carnival. So this had to be the preeminent cultural node of the city to hold every event where the audience and the performer were maximally close to each other, and it was not excluded that those who would have passed through it would even have joined in the action. I've heard, not in his writings, but I heard this from people who lived back then, and they witnessed that the discourse of the time included this idea. One may claim that this lower part of the cross-section, when it was used for those festivities, Tamanyan got closer to an interesting phenomenon, which I shall track through Vladimir Paperny's work, which is called in the Russian language Kultura 2, that is culture number 2. It was published for the first time in 1985 in the United States because the Soviet Union would not possibly have considered publishing it. It was republished. You see the dates down there. And in English, it was translated in 2002. Culture 2 would not have gone down well with the Anglophone readers, so it was renamed Architecture in the Age of Stalin to make it more palatable for the Anglophones. So we'll now dig deeper into what this culture 2 represents. So if there is culture 2, the implication is there's culture 1, of course. So I'm following up on this Vladimir Paperny's idea of culture 1, culture 2. This was the revolutionary mindset reflected in architecture, in that you never look back. You don't need the foundation, the Tsarist culture, the class culture. You now start from scratch, looking forward into the proletarian future. So according to Paperny, the main drive was expansion and being super egalitarian. Super egalitarian was the penchant. You may be aware the best examples of this are all over Russia. Ginsburg's buildings in Sverdlovsk and Ekaterinburg are the brilliant, and the Nezhnikov houses you might have heard of, were even sleeping quarters. There was a pavilion where all of the inhabitants had to converge to spend the night. dine together. Everything was intended to be done together. Everything was transparent. The main axis was that you did not have personal private space. Everything, these were the commune houses which seem to symbolize the time. And it's not incidental that the Armenian futurists, I think it's those who were looking forward and ahead, they subscribed to the same mindset, they thought alike and worked alike. Let me show you. This is our young architects, very talented. We have buildings that survived, built by them. These are the famous architects that built Moscow Cinema Theater, Gevor Kochar, Mazmanyan, Halabian. And they also published a futurist monthly, which was called Standard. This is the first issue. The architects came together in the Proletarian Architects Association of Armenia. The name itself alludes to the fact that they were representing Culture One. They both, Mazmanyan and Halabian, contributed to this standard. Yerisha Charens was the poet laureate who also contributed to this monthly. This title page that you see, here's the quote from Karl Marx with an English translation next to it. I'll read it through. Is Achilles possible with gunpowder and lead, or could the Iliad in general be positioned next to a printing press? And with the advent of mass media, don't we have legends and myths and songs and muses inevitably perishing? And along with it, the prerequisites that are necessary for epic poetry, Karl Marx. So looks as though he already was prescient about what fate befell upon Culture One. So these young proletarian architects representing Culture One, of course, were against Tamanyan's initiative. And what's remarkable is that when we say Culture One, Tamanyan de facto was also its representative when it comes to those celebrations and festivities. It was the same idea of carnival that he pushed forward, promoted, trying to put in the foundation of his people's house, where it doubled as a site venue for those celebrations. Our proletarian architects put up a serious fight against him, and they wrote a lengthy letter signed by all of our renowned, in the future, constructivist architects, whereupon they criticized Tamanyan, claiming that this was a throwback to Tsarist aesthetic, whatever. And instead of the people's house, one had to build the proletarian culture forges. This was reprinted in 29, if I'm not mistaken, in Zarya Vostoka in Tbilisi, this letter. So there were pretty grave attacks on Tamanyan. He was blamed particularly for, rather than building the people's house, building a church, cathedral. That is, he was engaged in building a religious structure. All of the articles, snipes and letters against him, criticizing him, which I reiterate were authored by our great architects. The first building that they broke ground for in 26, you may have been in the main square of the city. And this part of it was the first to be built by Tamanyan when this building was not yet in the plans. He built this section of it, where the People's Committee for Land Use was housed. In Armenian, the acronym is Hochjochkom, and I have to mention this by all means. Aramais Yezenkan was the commissar for land utilization. So when they write about Tamanyan, they seem to forget this fact. And only from this caricature you can see how they perceived how these young proletarian architects perceived his work. This is the caricature. Aramais Yerzangan's grandchild found this, and I borrowed it from him. There was another one where both of them were wearing church robes. But this approach is, from the scale, you can see the role that Aramais Yerzangan played in building this role. He is the diminutive figure held by Tamanyan. And yes, if you add the drama on it, it really turns into a church, everything included, nothing to hide. And Yerzangan is portrayed as a prostitute. And in classical Armenian, the caption is, since Yerzangan came from Erzincan, or had a connection with that native town, they made it as a colophon. Myself, Yerevan Gatsis have built the cathedral, and it's not incidental because Yerevan, and I'm telling this to highlight the scale, had he not backed Tamanyan, Tamanyan would not have built any building in those times. If you want my opinion, this is corroborated by a whole range of documents. Why? Because in de facto, he held various high offices through those times. He was a cabinet member of 21 in Soviet Armenia. He was in charge of the People's Committee for Land Use, for which this building was built. Apart from that, by the end of the 20s, he held the same office already in the Transcaucasian Federation cabinet. So the funding for this building was somehow within his influence at the Transcaucasian level. He didn't stay there long. Beginning with 1931, he was promoted to other high offices. Apart from that, he became the executive chairman of the Yerevan City Council. Basically, that was the equivalent of the mayor's office. So he was there to decide upon the city infrastructure. This is a portrait of Aramais Yerzangan. This is 1933 November 7 celebration, the parade. The building of the Central Committee of the party was not yet there. The Central Committee was in Albovian Street. I usually show this to my students when we go through visual anthropology. You have to determine who's the boss on this photo. Of course, this is Yerzangan, and that's first secretary of the Communist Party, Ağasi Khanjan. So you can judge from this what was the hierarchy in the city. So in 1937, Yerzangan was put up against a firing squad, and had Tamanyan not died in 36 of natural causes, quite probably the opera would have looked different, or we would not have it at all. And this is a quote by Tamanyan. He said that this dual-use building, half of it was open air, the other was confined. He decided to build it as a hybrid between Colosseum and Zvartnots. This is his quote, and I am thankful to Mark Grigorian's grandchild, Mark Grigorian Jr., who will soon publish the memoirs, not memoirs, all of the materials pertaining to his grandfather. And this is what he told, what Tamanyan told Mark Grigorian, his disciple. Well, you know, the Colosseum, and the other he really tried to build it like a church. So the criticism against him was not criticism, it was a result of proper adequate analysis. He was de facto building a cathedral. And these two paths were joined. This is the one facade, and he wanted to build it along the shape of Zvartnots. This is the ruins of Zvartnots, and this is the restoration by Tamanyan. For our foreign guests, Zvartnots is a 7th century masterpiece, at least in the Armenian cultural context, a cathedral that perished in a earthquake, and it has its wonderful features. It's not incidental that for building his cathedral, Tamanyan borrowed a lot from Zvartnots. Gagi Kashen used to be a church in Ani, dating back to early 11th century. Literally, it's a replica of Zvartnots, which also perished in a earthquake. This three-layered structure of Zvartnots was something unique. This is the restoration of Gagakashen by Toramanyan. And surprisingly, a similar structure is visible in the portrayal of the Ark of Noah in the Saint-Chapelle Church, which dates back to 13th century, but the origins are from the 11th century. So most probably this plaque was there. So one may ask, how come Zvartnots ended up on the Ark of Noah? This is the building of it. Harutun Marutyan is here with us, and he even has an article entitled Zvartnots on Noah's Ark, where he looks upon every incarnation or a hypothesis of why and how Zvartnots could have ended up here. This is whether this is really Zvartnots or whether it's a Zvartnots type building, whether it was Gagi Kashen, or maybe it's just a universal three-tiered design, and I'm inclined to this theory rather than directly replicating Zvartnots. This is the ideal structure of the universe, which is why those who carved Saint-Chapelle reproduced it rather than copied it. And this is what I saw in the vernissage here. It was painted by a young girl. I persuaded her. I wanted to get her in the frame, but she refused. She didn't know anything about Saint-Chapelle. But Zvartnots is descending on the summit of Ararat exactly like in the shape of Noah's Ark. So this mythical idea seems to be selected by Tamanyan. See how similar they are and how right are his critics claiming that the proletarian architects that criticize him did not hide the fact that he took borrowed elements from the church. This is taken from an academic publication by one of our, that he literally replicated certain things from Yerevan. There are some borrowings. Anyway, so this culture one was then replaced by culture two, which is the subject of discussion in Paperny's work. Culture two comes to hold this movement in architecture. It freezes, suspends, holds whatever was there and makes it hierarchic. When we look at the buildings, they just add balconies, sort of a hierarchic classification comes about. Not to expand too much, let me illustrate it with the most famous example briefly. The Palace of Councils, which we could really claim is the line after which culture one perishes and culture two emerges. All of the proponents of culture one, they end up marginalized. For example, Moscow's film theater, that was the brilliant work of the constructivist Georg Kochar. It has nice bas reliefs and ornaments that it definitely would not have had it been built earlier. And he built it in the early 30s. Let me also add that these constructivists who were criticizing Tamanyan, many of them, with the exception of Halabian, who sneaks through somehow and becomes chief architect when in 1931 they create the Architects Association. For many years, he was the first and sitting chairperson of the Architects Association of the Soviet Union, whereas Mazmanyan and Kochar were exiled. Mazmanyan started to build Norilsk already in exile. Thankfully, they both got back from exile, and I'll still say a few words about them. So when this Palace of Peoples was built, it wasn't built, it was decided to be built. They chose a site for it where a 19th century cathedral was erected, dedicated to 1812 patriotic war veterans and victims. They just blew it up, exactly what we were suspecting Tamanyan would have done. He demolished the Gethsemane chapel for a different reason, and this is a motto. Instead of the den of opiate, we'll build a palace. They blew it up. They started to dig the foundations for the largest ever structure that had to epitomize culture too. To get a better idea, there were about 160 contributions to the competition of designs, including by Le Corbusier. The first place was awarded to design by Iofan, Schuko, and Gelfreich in 1932. In 1932, the initial drawings were already available, and it had to be topped off by the epitome of hierarchic culture to this is no longer any egalitarianism. There is this important feature here. The assumption was that the parade had to go through the palace in the initial idea, but this was still a relic of culture one. So it's not incidental that pretty soon, in 32, if I'm not mistaken, Ginsburg proposed to build a theater in Sverdlovsk, current-day Yekaterinburg. They hold a party meeting there and decide that they should eliminate this pass-through. There will be no longer pass-through. Culture one is completely, that is, eliminated, eradicated. Let's remember that Tamanyan proposed this idea in 1926, when culture two was not yet even in the workings. And let me add one more interesting thing to give you an idea about the dimensions that were intended. This is where it had to be built, and the Lenin statue that were to top it off had to be sculpted by Merkurov, who did another one in Yerevan. He was a sculptor of Greek origin, born in Armenia. It had to have a height of 100 meters, and all of the building had to be 420 meters high. There is an interesting episode in this struggle between constructivism and proletarian architects and Tamanyan. As early as in 1925, Stalin made this famous statement about how new culture should look like. He said, it should be proletarian in essence, but national in form. So this was his formulation for the first time in 1925. And the proletarian architects, of course, took advantage of this. Later in 1931, he repeats it in a different formulation. Should be socialist in nature and national in form. So the content has to be socialist, the form has to be national. So this is where Tamanyan mounts the horse. And so look at it, this is nationally in form. It's in the form of Zwartnot. What more national do you want? So it was already possible to look at it in retrospect. All of culture too was a look back. not into the future. The future, of course, stayed, but it was already permissible to look back as well. So this was like the symbolism of all successive empires. When I quickly showed you the different designs submitted to the competition for one of them was identical to Zikkurat. So you could even look back at historical empires and incorporating them in the Stalin type culture to structures. Tamanyan also looked back, and that was Armenian architecture. So he was fully entitled to quote. He writes in Pravda about it. So he won, basically, one may say, in this struggle, although both were using the same grounds. So this temptation of the Palace of Councils that had to be the ultimate structure, this temptation, Tamanyan was not immune to either, or his surroundings. His great-grandchild laments the fact that his great-grandfather has succumbed to that temptation. Gvansere did this by his design. And let me also add this. You see this sculpture. This is the early design. Culture 2 was not yet created. This is end of 20s, early 30s. I didn't find the date on this scaled model. It seems to have been prescient of what in Stalinist architecture emerged later. All of these high-rises Stalinist structures have these sculptures embellishing them. So Tamanyan designed this interesting thing. You may even guess that it's the opera building in the inside, but on the outside it's something similar to the Palace of Councils. And Merkurov also had to top it off with the statue. Thankfully, this building, they did not even attempt to proceed with this because it would have been extremely expensive and there were some other hazards to be considered. And in recollections of Mazmanyan, who, although seriously opposed this, and you can see it in archival materials available today. But in his memoirs, when he got back from exile, and they were published in 1960, he recounts how Sahatler Gabrelian summoned him after the exile, who was like the equivalent of a prime minister back then. He liked this design and asked him, should we go ahead with this or not? He wanted to do this to catch up with Moscow, but Mazmanyan told him that he himself admitted that it wasn't worth it, and that played an important role in the final decision. It's very good that this never materialized. Mazmanyan tells that Tamanyan was so happy that he even was leapfrogging 2 stairs at once from coming out from that office when it became clear it's not going to be built. I'll try to fast forward. The Palace of Councils never materialized either. The Second World War started. They could not spend so much metal on this building, which is why they refrained. Instead, they built the Stalinist high-rises, the skyscraper, so to say. This was the first by the same authors predominantly, so it's symmetrical, and I'll briefly reflect on that as well. Instead, they built several similar such Stalinist high-rises. This is known as Stalinist architecture. Sometime later down the road, in 1960s, they decide to use the same site for a big swimming pool. And it was very important because culture 2, Paperny demonstrates that culture 2 also requires water. So the university is in the background. The painter saw it better than the photographer, let's put it that way. In the 90s, they eliminated the swimming pool as well and rebuilt, brought back the old cathedral. This you can very well see the gilded cupolas, and this was paid for by Zurab Tsereteli, who distorted Moscow with his statues. What befell on this design? Tamanyan died in 1936 after a grave depression because his beloved daughter passed away. So they instruct his son, Georg Tamanyan, to complete the project. There is an interesting episode here that even genius architects need good editors. So his son seems to be exactly that, a literate editor. So thankfully this design doesn't materialize. Instead, in 39 they complete that which we already are familiar with, and he decides to eliminate most of his father's culture one ramifications, gets rid of them, and instead of the iron partition they build a stone wall, symmetrically replicating the other side. The symmetry and the asymmetry I'll briefly go through is the most symmetric, as you see, is this Lomonosov Moscow State University. The most asymmetric is Tamanyan's Coliseum and Zvartnots hybrid, which his son basically made more symmetric. So his famous building, which is one of Yerevan's brands, as you see, even on backgammon boards, they have it alongside Zvartnots, on chocolate box designs. So China, when they donated these buses to Yerevan, next to the Great Wall of China, they put this building. So this is equal in its symbolism for Armenia. But this is asymmetric, as you see. So I can't pin down the architects, but these are the Stalin type architects that claim this is not right. It had to be symmetric. They approached the Secretary General of the party, demanding that things be changed. But here again, the Georg Tamanyan played his role. He thought this was quite adequate, nothing. And Mark Grigoryan also played a role here. He persuaded the Arutyunov, the first secretary of the party, that it should stay as is. Whereas here's what Tamanyan had in mind. There had to be a tower in this section. Our contemporary architects decided to propose their takes on these, but something was missing there. This is a souvenir from the vernissage, where they placed even Ararat right there where the tower belonged. Although Ararat is located elsewhere. But this is asking for it. So Tamanyan was truly thinking about two towers. Here's where the tower should have been, but Mark Grigoryan and Sarapian built different building in 1950, which was completed in 1970. You can see this here, the building, how this one impedes with the other. The assumption was that there should have been two major structures. One was that tower that was never built on the square, and the other should have been the opera. They should have been joined by this axis. You can see it better here by the Northern Avenue, which has already been opened up nowadays. But this building is still here. It should have resonated with this one. So when there is one already in place, the second one is redundant. This is very similar to those ziggurats that were epitomizing culture too. And it's an almost similar design had been submitted to that competition. So if we're trying to find the reverberations of Stalinist architecture, we should look rather here, but not in Tamanyan's buildings. So it's not incidental that when Mark Grigoryan, after Tamanyan's death, took over the completion of the entire square, he also proposed to include water. And here's where we have this pond with singing fountains. Remember, I said that culture too must have had water accompanying it. So Tamanyan And this is that pool in Moscow. I have to briefly highlight the most important feature of Tamanyan. Tamanyan assumed that this feast celebration, the main procession, had to take place either through his building or in front of it. And all of a sudden, it turned into a reality. In this very same location, here's what transpired, which is now they're trying to replicate as we speak. This is how it started, the popular movements in Yerevan. This is the locus. I have several papers where I can prove that this was a political celebration. It has every feature of a festivity. What he assumed and what his son shut down by eliminating the Colosseum's Wartnots hybrid became a reality in 1988. Hakopian, the great painter, shared his impressions of the time. Is a fully festive mood in his 2000 painting. So, and this is my last statement. In fact, many people tried to claim Tamanyan and rank him with Stalinist architecture. And I tried to demonstrate to you that he is culture too. He is the Armenian take on culture too. Typically Armenian. And this was created, this predated the Stalinist culture too by far. That's the main premise of my communication. And let me add one more thing. He believed that this was predated by an ancient temple of culture. Even being the head of the architecture committee, he did not do any excavation, order any excavation. He didn't commission it. So he reverted to explosions to expedite the building. It didn't matter to him to verify whether there was something there. He was so certain of it. And this is typically a typical approach of culture too. Not looking back, looking ahead, but not towards this, towards the heights, the huge structures in the Armenian history, which he found in Swartnots. So I thank you for your attention, and I thank Tamanyan for this.